Jacob Thornton woke to the sound of wind rattling his cabin door. The same wind that had been his only companion for 2 long years. He rolled out of his makeshift bed, a thin mattress stuffed with pine needles and covered with a worn wool blanket. His joints ached from the cold mountain air, and his beard had grown wild and untamed. Reaching nearly to his chest, the cabin was small, barely large enough for one person. Jacob had built it himself after the fire took everything else. 4 walls of rough-cut logs, a simple roof that leaked when it rained hard, and a stone fireplace that threw more smoke than heat. It wasn't much, but it was his. Nobody could take it from him, and nobody wanted to. He stepped outside into the crisp morning air, his breath forming small clouds in the cold. The nearest town of Millfield was 3 miles away, but it might as well have been on the other side of the world. Jacob had made that walk only a handful of times in the past 2 years, and each time had been worse than the last. The first time he'd gone to town after the fire, people had stared at him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. The second time, they whispered behind his back. By the third visit, mothers pulled their children closer when he walked by. Now, when he absolutely had to go for supplies, the storekeeper barely looked at him, taking his money with obvious distaste and pushing his goods across the counter. Like Jacob carried some terrible disease, Jacob walked to the creek that ran behind his property. The water was clear and cold, perfect for washing his face and filling his water bucket. He'd learned to love this creek over the past 2 years. It never judged him, never whispered about him, never blamed him for things that weren't his fault. But they had been his fault, hadn't they? That's what the people in town believed. That's what the sheriff had suggested when he'd come to investigate the fire. That's what Jacob told himself during the long, sleepless nights when the guilt ate at him like a hungry wolf. He could still remember that terrible night, as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. The rocking tea ranch had been his pride and joy, passed down from his father and grandfather before him. 500 acres of good grazing land, a sturdy ranch house, and 200 head of cattle. He'd worked that land since he was old enough to hold a rope, and he'd loved every sunrise and sunset on it. The fire had started in the barn. Jacob had been in town that evening, something he rarely did, but old Pete Wilson had been celebrating his birthday at the saloon and had insisted Jacob join him. They'd shared a few drinks and talked about cattle prices and the weather. Jacob had ridden home around midnight, tired and looking forward to his bed. He'd seen the orange glow before he'd even reached the ranch. By the time he'd gotten there, the barn was completely engulfed in flames. The wind had been strong that night, pushing the fire toward the house and the pastures where his cattle grazed. Jacob had fought the fire alone for hours, using bucket after bucket of water from the but it was no use. The flames were too big, too hungry. By morning, everything was gone. The barn, the house, the fences, and most of his cattle. A few had survived, but they were so badly burned that Jacob had to put them out of their misery. He'd stood in the ashes of his life, covered in soot and smoke, and wondered what he was supposed to do next. The questions had started immediately. How had the fire begun? Why hadn't he been there to stop it? Had he left a lantern burning in the barn? Had he been careless with his pipe? The sheriff had poked through the ruins for days, asking the same questions over and over, as if Jacob hadn't already asked them of himself 1,000 times. Jacob had told them the truth. He'd been careful, like always. He'd checked the barn before leaving for town, like always. He'd put out his pipe hours before going to the saloon, like always. But the truth wasn't enough. People needed someone to blame, and Jacob was the only one left. The rumors had started slowly. Someone had seen him stumbling out of the saloon that night. Someone else remembered him acting strange in the weeks before the fire. Another person swore they'd seen him arguing with his hired hand, though Jacob had worked alone for years. The stories grew and changed with each telling, until Jacob barely recognized himself in them. Within a month, Jacob had become the man who'd burned down his own ranch. Maybe for the insurance money, some said. Maybe because he'd been drinking too much, others whispered. Maybe because he'd just gone crazy living alone out there for so long. The reasons didn't matter. What mattered was that Jacob Thornton was no longer welcome in Millfield. He'd tried to rebuild at first. He'd used what little money he had to buy lumber and nails, thinking he could start over, but the lumber never arrived. The bank wouldn't give him a loan. The neighboring ranchers stopped talking to him. Even old Pete Wilson, who'd been like a father to him, had crossed the street to avoid him. That's when Jacob had realized the truth. He was no longer part of the community. He was an outsider, a man without a place, someone to be feared and avoided. So he'd packed what little he had left and walked away from the ruins of his old life. He'd found this spot by accident, following the creek up into the mountains until he couldn't walk anymore. The land wasn't good for much, too rocky and steep, for farming or grazing, but it was isolated and peaceful. Nobody else wanted it, which made it perfect for a man like Jacob. Building the cabin had taken him 3 months. He'd cut every log himself, shaped every board with his own hands. The work had been good for him, giving him something to focus on besides his anger and grief. When winter came, he'd been ready, or as ready as a man could be for a life of complete solitude. The first winter had been the hardest. Not because of the cold or the isolation, but because he'd still hoped things might change. He'd imagined that people would forget about the fire, that someone would discover what had really happened, that he'd be welcomed back into the community. He'd known his whole life, but spring had come and gone, then summer, then another winter, and nothing had changed. Jacob had stopped hoping and started accepting. This was his life now. This cabin, this creek, these mountains, and the wind that never stopped blowing. He'd learned to hunt and trap, to preserve meat for the winter, to find edible plants in the forest. He'd learned to cut his own hair and mend his own clothes. He'd learned to live without human conversation, without laughter, without the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with another person. Most of all, he'd learned to live with the silence. The terrible, endless silence that filled his days and haunted his nights. Sometimes he talked to himself just to hear a human voice, but even that had become rare. What was the point of words when there was no one to hear them? As Jacob filled his water bucket and walked back to the cabin, he tried not to think about what the day would bring. It would be the same as yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. He would check his traps, maybe catch a fish or two, repair something that had broken during the night. He would eat alone, sleep alone, and wake up tomorrow to do it all again. This was his life now. This was what he'd chosen, or what had been chosen for him. Either way, there was no going back. The autumn afternoon was turning cold when Jacob decided to check his trap lines one last time before winter settled in for good. He'd been putting off this particular route for weeks, but the traps near the far creek needed attention. The walk would take him almost 2 hours, but he had nothing else to do. Time meant nothing when you had too much of it. Jacob shouldered his rifle and started down the familiar path. The leaves crunched under his worn boots, and the air carried that sharp smell that meant snow was coming soon. He'd learned to read the signs over the past 2 years. The mountains had their own language, and Jacob had become fluent in it. The first 3 traps were empty, which didn't surprise him. Game was getting scarce as winter approached. The 4th trap had caught a small rabbit, which would make a decent meal. Jacob reset the trap and continued walking, his mind wandering to the supplies he'd need to gather before the heavy snows came. He was thinking about firewood when he heard it, a soft groaning sound that didn't belong to the forest. Jacob stopped walking and listened carefully. The sound came again, weak and distant. Coming from the direction of the creek, Jacob approached slowly, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle. In 2 years of living alone, he'd learned to be cautious about unexpected sounds. Bears sometimes came to the creek to drink, and an injured bear was dangerous. But as he got closer, he realized the sound wasn't coming from an animal. It was coming from a person. Jacob pushed through the thick brush that grew along the creek bank, and what he saw made him freeze. A young woman lay crumpled on the rocky ground about 20 feet from the water's edge. She was on her side, one arm twisted beneath her body. Her long auburn hair spread across the stones like spilled copper. For a moment, Jacob couldn't move. He hadn't seen another human being in over 3 months, and certainly not a woman. He'd almost forgotten what they looked like, how different they were from the rough men he occasionally encountered in town. The woman groaned again, and the sound snapped Jacob back to reality. He hurried to her side, kneeling carefully on the wet stones. She was unconscious, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Her dress was torn in several places, and her hands were scraped and bleeding. Jacob's eyes moved to the horse lying motionless about 50 feet away. The animal was clearly dead, its front leg bent at an impossible angle. Jacob could see the prairie dog hole that had caused the accident hidden among the tall grass. The horse had stepped in it at full gallop and broken its leg. The rider had been thrown clear, but not far enough to avoid injury. Jacob looked back at the woman. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with delicate features that spoke of a life far removed from the harsh realities of frontier living. Her dress, though torn and dirty, was made of fine fabric. Her hands were soft, without the calluses that marked people who worked with their hands. Everything about her suggested wealth and education, two things Jacob had little experience with. A leather satchel lay scattered nearby, its contents spilled across the ground. Jacob gathered the items carefully, his rough hands handling the delicate papers with surprising gentleness. There were letters addressed to Miss Eleanor Whitmore in an elegant script that Jacob could barely read. A train ticket to San Francisco was folded carefully in an envelope, along with what looked like a considerable amount of money. Jacob sat back on his heels, staring at the unconscious woman. Eleanor Whitmore. The name meant nothing to him, but the train ticket told a story. She'd been traveling to Millfield, probably to catch the westbound train. The railroad station was still another 5 miles beyond town. A hard journey even in good weather. Jacob's first instinct was to walk away. He'd spent 2 years avoiding human contact, and getting involved with a stranger would only bring trouble. People would ask questions. They'd want to know why he'd been the one to find her, what he'd been doing in the area, whether he could be trusted with a helpless woman. But even as these thoughts ran through his mind, Jacob knew he couldn't leave her. The temperature was dropping and night was coming fast. If he left her here, she'd be dead by morning. No matter what the people in town thought of him, Jacob wasn't a murderer. He checked her pulse first, the way his father had taught him to do with injured horses. Her heartbeat was weak but steady. Her breathing was shallow but regular. She had a large bump on her forehead where she'd hit the ground, and her left arm might be broken, but she was alive. Jacob gently lifted her eyelids, checking her pupils the way the town doctor had shown him years ago. They were the same size, which was a good sign. He felt along her arms and legs, checking for broken bones. Her left wrist was definitely injured, maybe sprained, maybe broken. Her ribs seemed intact, though she'd have bruises for weeks. The sun was getting lower in the sky, and Jacob realized he had to make a decision quickly. He could try to get her to town, but that would mean carrying her over 3 miles of rough terrain in the dark. The people in Millfield would probably blame him for her injuries anyway. They'd assume he'd had something to do with the accident, just like they'd blamed him for the fire, or he could take her to his cabin. It was less than a mile away, and he could care for her there until she was strong enough to travel. It wasn't much, but it was warm and dry, and Jacob had learned basic medical care from necessity over the past 2 years. Jacob made his choice. He carefully gathered Eleanor's belongings and stuffed them back into the satchel. Then he slipped, his arms under her body, lifting her as gently as he could. She was lighter than he'd expected, and her head fell against his shoulder as he stood up. The walk back to his cabin felt like the longest mile of Jacob's life. Eleanor's unconscious. Weight seemed to grow heavier with each step, and he had to stop several times to rest. But it wasn't the physical burden that troubled him. It was the strange feeling of holding another human being, of being responsible for someone other than himself. Jacob hadn't touched another person in over 2 years. The simple contact of skin against skin, even through fabric, was almost overwhelming. He could smell her hair, a sweet scent that was nothing like the harsh soap he used. He could feel her breath against his neck, warm and alive. As he walked, Jacob found himself looking down at her face. Even unconscious and injured, she was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. Her skin was smooth and pale, her eyelashes dark against her cheeks. Her lips were slightly parted, and Jacob had the strangest urge to speak to her, to tell her everything would be all right. But he didn't speak. He just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, carrying this mysterious woman toward his lonely cabin as the sun set behind the mountains. With each step, Jacob felt something changing inside him. Something he'd thought was dead and buried with his old life. By the time he reached his cabin, full darkness had fallen. Jacob kicked the door open with his foot and carried Eleanor inside, laying her gently on his bed. She looked impossibly small and fragile against the rough blankets, like a flower that had been dropped in a field of stones. Jacob lit his oil lamp and looked down at her, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. New problems he hadn't faced in years. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, Jacob wouldn't be alone with just the wind for company. Tonight, he had someone to care for besides himself. Jacob hadn't slept properly in 3 days. Every few hours, he'd wake up to check on Eleanor, watching her chest rise and fall in the dim light of the oil lamp. He'd made himself a bed on the floor using his winter coat and an old blanket, but rest came in short, restless bursts during the first night. Eleanor had been completely still, so quiet that Jacob had pressed his ear to her chest several times just to make sure she was still breathing. Her pulse was weak but steady, and the bump on her forehead had turned a deep purple. Jacob had seen enough injuries on the ranch to know that head wounds were serious business. He'd tried to remember everything his grandmother had taught him about healing herbs. She'd been the closest thing to a doctor the area had back then, and Jacob had followed her around as a boy, learning which plants could help and which ones could harm. Most of that knowledge had been buried under years of ranch work and grief, but caring for Eleanor brought it all back. Jacob had made his first trip to gather herbs while Eleanor slept. He'd found willow bark near the creek, good for pain and fever. Wild mint grew in patches along the mountainside, perfect for upset stomachs. There were elderflowers near his cabin, dried from the summer heat, which his grandmother had always used for headaches. Making the tea had been harder than finding the herbs. Jacob's hands shook as he prepared the mixture, and he realized he'd forgotten how to be gentle. 2 years of living alone had made him rough and clumsy. He'd gotten used to handling everything with the same crude efficiency he used to chop wood or skin rabbits, but Eleanor was different. She was delicate, fragile, and Jacob found himself moving more carefully than he had in years. He'd torn strips from his cleanest shirt to make bandages for her scraped hands, and had used his precious supply of clean water to wash the dirt from her face. On the second day, Eleanor had started to mumble in her sleep. Jacob couldn't understand most of it, but he'd caught fragments. Something about a wedding, about someone named Richard, about needing to get away. Her voice had been scared and desperate, even in sleep, and Jacob had found himself reaching out to smooth her hair back from her forehead. The touch had surprised him. He hadn't realized he was going to do it until his rough palm was resting against her soft skin. Eleanor had seemed to calm at his touch, her breathing becoming deeper and more regular. Jacob had pulled his hand back quickly, embarrassed by his own boldness. That afternoon, Eleanor had opened her eyes for the first time. They were green, the color of spring grass, and they'd looked around the cabin with confusion and fear. Jacob had been sitting at his small table, trying to repair a torn trap, when he'd heard her move. "Where am I?" she'd whispered, her voice barely audible. Jacob had stood up so quickly he'd knocked over his chair. "You're safe," he'd said, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. "You fell from your horse. I found you by the creek." Eleanor had tried to sit up, but the effort had made her wince and fall back against the pillow. "My horse," she'd sighed, and Jacob had seen tears forming in her eyes. "I'm sorry," Jacob had said. "The horse didn't make it. Broke its leg in a prairie dog hole." Eleanor had closed her eyes and been quiet for a long time. Jacob had thought she'd fallen back asleep, but then she'd spoken again. "I need to get to the train station," she'd said. "I have a ticket to San Francisco." Jacob had wanted to tell her that the train station was still miles away, that she was in no condition to travel, that she needed to rest and heal. But something in her voice had stopped him. There was desperation there, and fear, and Jacob had recognized it because he'd felt the same way the night his ranch burned down. "You can't travel yet," he'd said finally. "You hit your head pretty hard. You need to rest." Eleanor had looked at him then, really looked at him, and Jacob had felt suddenly aware of how he must appear to her. His beard was wild and unkempt, his clothes were patched and dirty, and he probably smelled like wood smoke and unwashed skin. He'd stepped back, embarrassed. "Who are you?" Eleanor had asked, but her voice hadn't been afraid, just curious. "Jacob," he'd said, "Jacob Thornton. This is my cabin." Eleanor had nodded slowly, and Jacob had seen her taking in the rough walls, the simple furniture, the sparse decorations. If she'd been disgusted by what she saw, she'd hidden it well. "Thank you," she'd said, and then she'd fallen back asleep. That night, Jacob had done something he hadn't done in over 2 years. He'd looked at himself in the piece of broken mirror he kept on his shelf. The face looking back at him was almost unrecognizable. His hair hung past his shoulders, tangled and dirty. His beard was streaked with gray and full of knots. His eyes looked wild, like those of an animal that had been trapped for too long. Jacob had heated water in his cooking pot and had carefully washed his face and hands. Then he'd taken his father's old razor and had slowly, carefully begun to cut away the wilderness that had grown over his features. It had taken him over an hour, and he'd nicked himself several times, but when he was done, he'd looked almost human again. On the third day, Eleanor had been awake for longer periods. Jacob had helped her sit up and had given her some broth made from the rabbit he'd caught. She'd been weak and shaky, but she'd managed to eat. And Jacob had been proud of himself for remembering how to cook something that wasn't just barely edible. "I'm running away," Eleanor had said suddenly, while Jacob was cleaning her bowl. "From a man I'm supposed to marry. Richard Blackwood. He's cruel and controlling, and my father sold me to him like I was a piece of property." Jacob had stopped washing the bowl and had looked at her. Eleanor's eyes had been full of pain, but also determination. "I have an aunt in San Francisco," she'd continued. "She wrote to me, said she'd help me start over. But I have to get there first." Jacob had understood then why she'd been so desperate to reach the train station. She wasn't just traveling. She was escaping. "What happened to your family?" Eleanor had asked. "Why do you live alone out here?" Jacob had been quiet for a long time. He'd never told anyone the full story of the fire, of how the town had turned against him. But something about Eleanor's honesty had made him want to share his own burden. "I used to have a ranch," he'd said finally. "Lost it in a fire 2 years ago. People blamed me for it, said I was careless. Maybe I was. Anyway, I couldn't stay. In town after that? Too many people looking at me like I was dangerous." Eleanor had listened without judgment, and when Jacob had finished, she'd reached out and had touched his hand. Her fingers had been soft and warm, and Jacob had felt something he'd thought was dead inside him begin to stir. "I'm sorry," she'd said. "That must have been terrible." Jacob had looked down at their joined hands, amazed by how right it felt. "It was," he'd said. "But maybe it led me to where I needed to be." That evening, while Eleanor slept, Jacob had done something that would have seemed impossible just a few days before. He'd walked outside and had picked some of the last wildflowers of the season. They were small and simple, nothing fancy, but they'd added a touch of color to the cabin that had been missing for 2 years. When Eleanor had woken up the next morning and had seen the flowers, she'd smiled. It was the first real smile Jacob had seen in longer than he could remember, and it had lit up the entire cabin like sunrise after a long, dark night. The fourth morning brought something Jacob hadn't seen in 2 years of mountain sunrises. Eleanor was sitting up in bed when he woke, her auburn hair catching the golden light that streamed through the cabin's single window. She looked stronger, more alert, and when she saw him stirring on his makeshift bed on the floor, she smiled. It wasn't a polite smile or a grateful smile. It was pure and genuine, lighting up her entire face and making her green eyes sparkle with warmth. Jacob felt something shift inside his chest, like a door that had been locked for years suddenly swinging open. He'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone smile at him like that, to be looked at with something other than fear or suspicion. "Good morning," Eleanor said, her voice still soft but much stronger than it had been. "I feel so much better." Today, Jacob sat up, suddenly aware that his hair was sticking up in all directions and that he probably looked like he'd been sleeping on the ground, which he had. "That's good," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Real good?" Eleanor laughed, a sound like water running over stones, and Jacob realized he'd been staring at her. "You have the most interesting way of speaking," she said. "It's honest." "I like that." Jacob wasn't sure what to say to that. In town, people had always made fun of the way he talked, said he sounded like an uneducated mountain man. Eleanor made it sound like a good thing. "I made some coffee," Jacob said, gesturing toward the pot on his small stove. "Well, it's not really coffee. More like chicory and some herbs, but it's warm." Eleanor's smile widened. "I'd love some. I haven't had a proper cup of anything in days." Jacob poured the steaming liquid into his only good cup, a tin mug his father had given him years ago. He handed it to Eleanor carefully, making sure their fingers didn't touch. He wasn't sure why he avoided the contact, but something about Eleanor made him nervous in a way he didn't understand. Eleanor took a sip and made a face that was half surprise, half delight. "It's different," she said diplomatically. "But it's good. Thank you." Jacob found himself smiling back and realized it was the first time he'd smiled in months. "My grandmother used to make it this way," he said. "She said real coffee was too expensive for everyday drinking, but this would keep you warm and awake just the same." "Tell me about your grandmother," Eleanor said, settling back against the pillow Jacob had made for her from his spare clothes. Jacob hesitated. He'd gotten out of the habit of talking about his family, about the time before the fire when he'd been part of something bigger than himself. But Eleanor looked genuinely interested, and Jacob found himself wanting to share. She was tough as leather, he said, settling into his chair. "Came out here with my grandfather when this was still wild territory. She could shoot a rifle better than most men, deliver a baby, and treat everything from snake bites to broken bones. She taught me about plants and herbs, showed me how to read the weather and the seasons." Eleanor listened with complete attention, asking questions that showed she was really hearing him. Jacob found himself telling her things he hadn't thought about in years. Stories about his grandmother's remedies, about the time she'd scared off a bear with nothing but a frying pan and a loud voice, about the way she'd sung while she worked in her garden. "She sounds wonderful," Eleanor said when Jacob paused. "I wish I could have met her." "She would have liked you," Jacob said without thinking, then felt his face grow warm. "I mean, she liked people who weren't afraid of hard work, and you're not complaining about living in a cabin with no proper furniture and eating rabbit stew." Eleanor laughed again, and Jacob felt that strange warmth in his chest spread further. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said. "Though I have to admit, this is the most comfortable I've felt in years." Jacob looked at her in surprise. "Comfortable? In here?" Eleanor gestured around the small cabin, taking in the rough walls, the simple furniture, the basic conditions. "In St. Louis, I lived in a house with 12 rooms and 5 servants. Everything was perfectly decorated, perfectly arranged, perfectly uncomfortable. I couldn't sit in the parlor without worrying about wrinkling my dress. I couldn't eat without using the right fork for each course. I couldn't even laugh too loudly without my mother reminding me that ladies don't make such sounds." Jacob tried to imagine living like that, but couldn't. "Sounds like a prison," he said. "It was," Eleanor sighed quietly. "A very pretty prison with silk curtains and fine china, but still a prison." Jacob understood then why she'd been so desperate to escape, why she'd been willing to travel alone to San Francisco. "What made you decide to run?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, staring into her cup. "Richard Blackwood came to dinner one night," she said finally. "He's the man my father arranged for me to marry. He's wealthy and powerful, and he thinks that gives him the right to own people. During dinner he told me exactly what my life would be like as his wife, what I would wear, where I would go, how I would spend my days. He spoke about me like I was a horse he was buying. Jacob felt anger rising in his chest, a protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. "What did you do?" "I excused myself from the table and went to my room," Eleanor said. "Then I packed a bag, took my mother's jewelry to sell for traveling money, and left that night. I've been running ever since." Jacob admired her courage. He'd run away too, but he'd been driven out by shame and anger. Eleanor had chosen to leave, had taken control of her own life when everyone else was trying to control it for her. "I'm glad you did," Jacob said. "Run away, I mean. Takes guts to start over." Eleanor looked at him with those green eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "You started over too," she said. "After the fire, you could have left the territory entirely, gone somewhere no one knew you. But you stayed. You built this place with your own hands. That takes courage, too." Jacob had never thought of it that way. To him, building the cabin had been about survival, about having somewhere to hide from the world. But Eleanor made it sound like something brave, something worthy of respect. Over the next few days, Eleanor grew stronger. She started helping with small tasks around the cabin, insisting that she needed to feel useful. Jacob showed her how to prepare the herbs for tea, how to mend torn fabric, how to cook rabbit stew that didn't taste like leather. Eleanor, in turn, shared stories about her life in St. Louis. She told Jacob about the books she'd read, the places she'd dreamed of visiting, the music she'd played on her piano. She had a way of describing things that made them come alive. And Jacob found himself looking forward to their conversations more than anything else in his day. One afternoon, while Eleanor was helping Jacob sort through his collection of herbs, she started humming. It was a simple tune, nothing fancy, but it filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the fireplace. "What's that song?" Jacob asked. Eleanor looked up, surprised. "Oh, just something I learned as a child. My mother used to sing it to me when I was scared." "It's pretty," Jacob said, and realized he meant it. "I haven't heard music in 2 years." Eleanor smiled, and Jacob felt that now familiar warmth in his chest. "Would you like me to sing it?" Jacob nodded, suddenly feeling shy. Eleanor's voice was soft and clear, and as she sang, Jacob felt something he'd thought was dead forever beginning to stir inside him. It was hope, he realized. For the first time in 2 years, Jacob Thornton felt hopeful about tomorrow. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing their simple meal, Eleanor said something that made Jacob choke on his food. "I'm happy here," she said simply. "Happier than I've been in years." Jacob looked at her, this refined woman who'd given up luxury for life in a mountain cabin, and felt something crack open in his heart. "So am I," he said, "happier than I've been since before the fire." Eleanor reached across the small space between them and took his hand. This time Jacob didn't pull away. Her fingers were warm and soft, and they fit perfectly in his rough palm. "Thank you," she said, "for saving me, for taking care of me, for reminding me what it feels like to be free." Jacob squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for reminding me what it feels like to be human." They sat like that as the fire burned low, 2 damaged souls who had found something precious in each other's company. Outside, the wind still howled through the mountains, but inside the cabin, there was warmth and laughter and something that felt very much like home. Jacob woke to the sound of horses. Multiple horses, their hooves beating against the rocky ground outside his cabin. He sat up quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle he kept beside his bed. In 2 years of living alone, no one had ever come to his cabin uninvited. Eleanor was already awake, sitting up in bed with fear written across her face. "They found me," she whispered, and Jacob heard the terror in her voice. Jacob moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. 5 men on horseback were approaching the cabin, led by a tall man in an expensive dark coat. Even from a distance, Jacob could see this wasn't a friendly visit. The men rode with the confidence of people who were used to getting what they wanted. "Stay back," Jacob told Eleanor, but she was already out of bed. Moving to the window beside him, she looked outside and went pale. "It's him," she said, "Richard Blackwood. And he's brought help." Jacob studied the approaching men. Richard Blackwood was exactly what Jacob had expected from Eleanor's description. He was tall and well-dressed, with the kind of face that had never known real hardship. His clothes were expensive, his horse was the finest Jacob had ever seen, and everything about him screamed money and power. The other four men looked like hired muscle. They wore guns on their hips and had the hard eyes of men who solved problems with violence. Jacob recognized the type from his ranch days. Rich men like Blackwood never got their own hands dirty. Eleanor Whitmore. Richard's voice boomed across the clearing as he dismounted. I know you're in there. Come out now, and we can forget this foolishness. Jacob felt Eleanor's hand slip into his. Her fingers were trembling, but her voice was steady when she spoke. I'm not going back, she said. Not to him, not to that life. Jacob squeezed her hand. You don't have to, he said. This is my land. They can't force you to go anywhere. But even as he said it, Jacob knew it wasn't true. Men like Richard Blackwood didn't follow the same rules as everyone else. They had money and influence, and they used both to get what they wanted. Eleanor! Richard called again, his voice getting louder and more impatient. Your father sent me to bring you home. You're going to be my wife, and this little adventure is over. Jacob watched Eleanor's face harden at those words. The fear was still there, but it was being replaced by something else. Anger, determination, the same look she'd had when she'd first told him about running away. I'll go talk to him, Jacob said, but Eleanor shook her head. No, she said. This is my fight. I need to face him. Jacob wanted to argue, but he could see in Eleanor's eyes that she was right. This was something she needed to do herself. But that didn't mean she had to do it alone. We'll go together, Jacob said. Eleanor looked at him, and Jacob saw something in her eyes that made his heart race. It was love, pure and simple, and it was directed at him. Together, she agreed. They walked outside hand in hand, and Jacob felt Richard's eyes taking in everything. His rough clothes, his simple cabin, the way Eleanor's fingers were intertwined. With his, Jacob could see the disgust and anger building in the other man's face. Eleanor, Richard said, his voice dripping with false concern. What has this man done to you? Look at yourself. You're dressed like a common frontier woman. Eleanor lifted her chin. I'm dressed like a free woman, she said. Something you wouldn't understand. Richard's face darkened. You belong to me, he said. Your father and I have an agreement. You're going to be my wife, and you're going to return to St. Louis with me right now. I belong to no one, Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger. And I'm not going anywhere with you. Richard's eyes shifted to Jacob, and Jacob felt the full force of the man's contempt. You, Richard said, pointing at Jacob. I don't know what kind of threats you've made to keep her here, but it's over. Release her now, and maybe I won't have you arrested? Jacob felt anger rising in his chest. I haven't threatened anyone. He said, Eleanor is here because she chooses to be. Richard laughed, a cold sound that had no humor in it. Choose? Look at this place. Look at you. You're nothing but a dirty mountain man living in a shack. What could you possibly offer a woman like Eleanor? Jacob felt Eleanor's hand tighten in his, and he realized she was trying to give him strength. I can offer her freedom, Jacob said. I can offer her respect. I can offer her a life where she's valued for who she is, not what she's worth. How noble, Richard sneered, but noble doesn't pay bills. Noble doesn't buy food or clothes or medicine? What happens when she gets sick? What happens when winter comes and your little cabin can't keep her warm? What happens when she realizes she's thrown away everything for a man who has nothing? Jacob felt doubt creeping into his mind. Richard was right about some things. Jacob didn't have money or influence. He couldn't offer Eleanor the comfort and security she'd known in St. Louis. All he had was a small cabin, a few traps and his own 2 hands, but then Eleanor spoke and her words cut through Jacob's doubts like a knife through butter. You want to know what he can offer me? Eleanor said, stepping closer to Richard. He can offer me honesty. He can offer me kindness. He can offer me a partnership where I'm treated like a human being, not a possession. He saved my life, Richard. He cared for me when I was hurt, and he never once asked for anything in return. Richard's face was getting redder with each word. "You're being foolish," he said. "You're throwing away everything for a man who lives like an animal." "I'm choosing love over money," Eleanor said. "I'm choosing freedom over comfort. I'm choosing a man who sees me as an equal over one who sees me as property." Jacob felt his heart swell with pride and love. Eleanor was choosing him, choosing this life, choosing to build something new rather than accept, something that would slowly destroy her spirit. Richard's patience finally snapped. "Enough," he said, gesturing to his men. "Take her. If she won't come willingly, we'll make her come." The 4 hired men dismounted and started toward Eleanor, but Jacob stepped in front of her. "You'll have to go through me first," he said, his hand moving to his rifle. For a moment the clearing was silent, except for the sound of the wind in the trees. Jacob could see the men calculating, deciding if they were willing to risk violence. Jacob was outnumbered, but he was fighting for something they couldn't understand. Eleanor moved to stand beside Jacob, no longer behind him. "I'm not going," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This is my choice, and I choose Jacob. I choose this life." "I choose love?" Richard stared at her for a long moment, and Jacob could see the exact moment when he realized he'd lost. Eleanor wasn't the frightened girl who'd run away from St. Louis. She was a woman who'd found her strength in her voice. "You'll regret this," Richard said finally. "When winter comes and you're cold and hungry, you'll remember what you gave up." "Maybe," Eleanor said, "but I'll be free, and I'll be with the man I love." Richard climbed back on his horse, his face twisted with rage and defeat. "Don't come crying to me when this all falls apart," he said, "and don't expect your father to welcome you back." "I won't," Eleanor said, "because I'm not going back. This is my home now." Jacob watched the men ride away, and only when they were out of sight did he allow himself to breathe again. Eleanor turned to him, and he saw tears in her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Are you sure?" Jacob asked. "About staying? About choosing this life?" Eleanor smiled, that same radiant smile that had changed everything for Jacob. "I've never been more sure of anything," she said. "I choose you, Jacob Thornton. I choose us." Jacob pulled her into his arms, and as they stood there in front of their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains, Jacob felt complete for the first time in years. They would face whatever came next together, and that made all the difference in the world.